get started, and we got some introductory material to go through here for the first 10 minutes or so. So hopefully people come in late won't miss too much. I am Jon Brisbin. I work for SpringSource. Been working on the Spring Data project for a while. What we're going to talk about today is Spring Data REST, the project Spring Data REST. Now, we've been talking about RESTful services and Spring HatOS and all things REST. That's a theme of this conference, as you probably noticed. This particular project is trying to implement best practices as they are today, right? As it's a very subjective thing, and we could get into an argument about what constitutes REST, what is a REST resource, what happens when you do a GET, what happens when you do a POST, and there's varying opinions about how that should happen. So what we've tried to do with Spring Data REST is provide an easy way for you to export JPA entities using the repository support in Spring Data in a standard way, and not having to write code, and being able just to interact with the RESTful service to do CRUD and finding entities and just your basic operations. There's additional things that can happen as a result of those activities happening within the exporter, which we'll talk about. Events, Spring integration. You can tie Spring integration into this. We can send RabbitMQ messages, and hopefully we'll be able to get through all that. I don't know if I want to take the full time. I know it's the last session, and I appreciate you guys staying, but we may kind of skate out of here a little bit. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. Okay. So we're trying to take the drudgery out of CRUD services, because what seems to happen when you create a REST service, you have, even if you're using a standard representation of JSON, if you're using a standard way to access URLs, and all of this stuff is in a Word document somewhere, it's just in your head even, and it conforms to some pattern. There hasn't previously been a way to do this without you having to go through all the drudgery of, accessing the service, saving the object. You have to worry about, marshalling and unmarshalling, and or serialization, deserialization, whichever term you prefer to use. So there's other things that you have to write that aren't directly related to your exposing a REST service. It's just plumbing. And if there's anything that we get out of, programmers always love to write these libraries, right? Because I don't want to have to write all the plumbing because it's boring. Okay, that's a valid reason, because if you're bored with what you're writing and not productive, then that's a bad thing. So, people kind of laugh at it, because developers, and we're kind of a strange bunch, I know, and we don't like to do things that are boring generally. So. We have these libraries to help us, and this is no exception. This is to help you get away from writing the boring code. And we do this in Spring Data using the repositories by implementing dynamic proxies. And we're able to add some magic to your classes in a way that's kind of similar to like doing Groovy and how you can add behavior, since we don't really have that in Java. We use dynamic proxies. And with the repository support, besides just CRUD, you can do finders basically, and you can use a standard naming convention on the method to get finder style automatic querying. Where it pulls out, parses the capital letters and everything, pulls out field names and values and things like that. So you don't have to actually write the JPQL query in the annotation, but you can do that if you need to do that. Now, right now, the Spring Data Repository support is really fleshed out in JPA and MongoDB, But for the REST exporter, we're only using the JPA portion of it. There's a fair amount of metadata and some other things that have to go along with that we just haven't, nobody's really asked about MongoDB, so we haven't built anything. So this is an example of what a repository would look like. This is all the code that you need to get full CRUD on an entity called person with an ID of long generated value, right? That is equivalent to that. So if you were to create this class, you would have to write and implement all of these methods, and that's what you get for free by using the repositories. So we've got some basic, find one, find all, count, various kinds of deletes, save, right? We've got all your basic operations. And since it's a requirement of the REST exporter that you extend the CRUD repository interface so that you get at least all these methods, the exporter knows, okay, now I can add REST semantics to this. And so basically how we've looked at this is pretty obvious. I mean, a put and a post is a save, so they're not the same. The HTTP spec, I know there's some, why do you use a put, why not use a post or whatever? And there was a question yesterday, I think it was in Ben Hale's session about, should you use a post to create a resource or put or assign an ID? I think that's what it was, assign an ID ahead of time. So basically the way we look at this and the way the HTTP spec reads, if you're into that sort of thing, is if you are creating a new resource and you don't have an identifier for it, you post it to a URL. That's like one less than what you would do if you were to get a specific resource. So if you've got a collection of resources, person, /person, then you would post into that, and it would create your resource, and then it would send you back the URI for the new resource. If you were going to pre-assign an ID, you would put to person/ID. And that's generally the pattern that you need to use. That's a pattern that we use here. So they're not the same. Put obviously would be for an update as well as creating a resource. And then pretty obvious, the find methods, find one, find all, and then all of your finder methods, find by whatever, are a get and a delete. So there's the four verbs that we're really concerned about. One of the things that we'll eventually get into at some point, is different representations, but I mean, JSON's pretty much standard now. And so if you're writing web applications, obviously you're going to use JSON because, the browser understands it's JavaScript and blah, blah, blah. It's not so obvious when you're using like machine-to-machine communication as to why you would use JSON. Why not use XML? There's different choices. You could serialize, create your own protocol, whatever. JSON is a ubiquitous protocol. It's lightweight. There's not a lot of characters in it. It defines your entity pretty well, reasonably well. And it works pretty well in all situations, whether you're using a web browser or, it's machine-to-machine communication and you're serializing it and, it never has to be human readable even. You would still could choose JSON in any of your services. So for the REST exporter purposes, we're using JSON as kind of this ubiquitous protocol because it's, simple and lightweight and whatnot. So there aren't alternative representations. You get JSON. So if you want JAXB, XML, whatever, pull requests, you can look in there. There's various ways that we can go about doing this, but as it stands at the moment, we're focusing on JSON because that it's a good choice. It's a 85-90% choice, and so that's what we're going to get. And one of the things that you can do with JSON in the browser and JavaScript is you can use JSON-P. And if you're not familiar with how JSON-P works, basically when you get a chunk of JSON, you can send a query parameter. It's configurable, but it defaults to callback. So you'd say, get this resource, or like a search method. And then you would say callback equals and give it a JavaScript function, right? That's what jQuery does under the covers if you're using the JSON-P support in jQuery. And the server will wrap your JSON object with a call to the JavaScript function. And so when that JavaScript goes back to the browser, it will immediately be evaled, and your function will be called, passing it the JSON, right? So two different ways to go about doing it, because if you're just doing a simple get, like $.get on a block of JSON, then you've got to deal with, jQuery handles that for you. But if you're doing, if you're using something else, then you may have to deal with, evaling, parsing, whatever, JSON.parse on the output. But with JSON-P, you don't have to worry about that. And then the JSON-P plus E is a little bit of an extension to JSON-P, where if you're going to send a request and you want your JavaScript function to be called, if you get an error condition in the server, you're going to get like a 500 or 400 or whatever the error code is. Well, the way JSON-P works is your JavaScript function won't be called because it doesn't send back the right data. It's an error, right? So it goes to the error handler, not the success handler. So what we've done in the Spring Data REST exporter is add JSON-P plus E, which means if you send it an error callback, then if there is an error on the server, it will capture it, turn it into a 200 OK, send back an appropriate response with your a reference to your JavaScript function passing two parameters. The first one being the error status code, the original 500, whatever it was, and then whatever the body is. And in the case of like validation errors, we send back a little JSON, a little chunk of JSON. So that's the JSON-P and JSON-P plus E support. It takes a little bit of getting used to and to how that works, but it seems to be pretty nice, and so it's there if you need it. But if you're just using the normal exporter, then you may not end up needing it. And I'm going to mention it, but I'm not really going to demo that part of it much. So one of the things that we have been talking about, and is probably heard mentioned quite a bit, is this, however you pronounce this, HatOS, blah, blah, whatever. The idea behind it is basically discoverability, and so that when you get the root of a service, it sends you back in some format, and it doesn't, there's no like standard as to how this is done. You send back a list of resources that are available from the root URL. So you could do that as there's actually a content type, text/URI-list, which is meant to be a list of URIs that you could send back. That's not JSON, obviously. If you're expecting JSON, that's not going to work. We do support text URI list as if you put accept text URI list on one of these, you'll get back a list of URIs. But the discoverability part is pretty important when it comes to HatOS. And the way Spring HatOS, the project, approaches this is to send back a JSON object with a links property, right, which is an array of small JSON objects that have a similarity to the Atom specification for the link tag, right? So it's not, there's not an enforced standard. I mean, it's just an object, and you could add other things to it if you were creating a custom service that, say, ran alongside REST exporter, and you wanted to provide a similar content to what the exporter is providing by default, then you could do that so that your resources looked very similar to what was coming out of the exporter. Then you'd need to either use the Spring HatOS resource object that you're returning and deal with the JSON conversion there, or just craft your own JSON response that has the links property, and then you could have additional metadata on your links tag. Right now we do rel and href. That's enough information for what we need in most circumstances. But if you're writing a service where there's actions going on, and that may not be enough information. You may need more than just the rel. You may need more than just the href. You may need additional pieces of information. That's stuff that you can add using the Spring HatOS, and we'll see how to add additional links and things like that in Spring Data REST. But I did want to mention that that's something that's really possible. And they do have different meanings in depending on at what point in the hierarchy. Are you at the very top? Are you accessing a resource or accessing a property of a resource? These links can mean different things in different contexts, and we'll see how links are handled by Spring Data REST, and it's you don't have to do it that way if you're writing your own service to expose those. And there's the basic link tag, which we're probably familiar from in HTML from a style sheet reference. So there's the link to the Spring HatOS library. It's not very big. There's just a few classes and some helper classes in the builder that you saw where you could do link to and give it a controller. So there's a few things like that that you can use in your own code, but just so that we're using the Spring HatOS resources so that we can have a consistent representation of JSON going back. And so if you're wanting to write custom services that run alongside the exporter, which is pretty likely, then you'll probably want to take a look at the Spring HatOS library and look at resources, look at resource, and maybe subclass those and add your own information however you want to do it. But definitely take a look at that so that you'll have a similar representation in your services. So if we start with just a plain repository application, we can restify it by simply adding a web configuration, putting our repository configuration as being the root context, so that everything is loaded and instantiated like it needs to be before the exporter comes along to look for things. And we can either use the specific servlet that is just a subclass of dispatcher servlet that sets two properties so that you don't have to do it in your code, or you can set up the dispatcher servlet yourself, and I'll show you both ways to do it. They're equally valid. That's the only thing that you need to do to get whatever is in your repositories exported. If you're going to be customizing any of the Spring MVC components that make up Spring Data REST, changing handler mapping, implementations, or any of the more like advanced, in-depth Spring MVC stuff, then you'll either want to import and which lets you override a couple things, or you'll want to extend the repository REST MVC configuration class, which is the core configuration class that has all of the Spring MVC references in it that set the exporter up. So if you want to know how the exporter is set up, at a very low level, and what different components are wired together, and what goes where, then take a look in the source code of the Spring Data REST project and look at this repository REST MVC configuration class, and that's got all the information in that you'll want. So here's what we'll add to our project in a web application initializer. So if you're not familiar with how that works, it's pretty simple. In Spring 3 and in Servlet 3, you get this web application initializer class, and you just declare these in your project, and the magic happens, and those will be instantiated and called when past your servlet context. So we do this rather than setting up a web.xml, because web.xmls are not fun. So, and this is cool and modern, right? So that's what we're going to set up here. We're going to set up our annotation config web application context. Register our application config. Okay. And now we want to add a new context loader listener. References our root context. Okay. And that'll get our basic configuration pulled in. which is right here. Okay, so we're looking for any components underneath this package name here that where we're sitting. We're enabling the JPA repositories and then turning on the transaction management. This is just your generic data source. We're just using HSQL here. Nothing fancy. So in your application, you just have these replaced with your Postgres or whatever database you're using. And here's a little JUnit test, just show that this is nothing fancy. We're just getting our repositories injected, and we're just doing a count on them. And that's our. And there's no web references or anything. I mean, you could just run this from the command line or JUnit test or whatever. So this is the only web reference that we're adding to make this webified. Is that a word? I don't know. So we've got this repository REST exporter servlet, which is just, like I said, a helper. All right, it just extends dispatcher servlet and sets the two values. Now you could just do the same thing by putting dispatcher servlet here, and doing the, and that would be useful. We might change that later. Like if you want to add your own configuration that's not in your root context. So if you've got your root application config and you want to just kind of leave that separate and don't want to have the REST references to things that are specifically from the Spring Data REST project, then you split it up that way and do your import there. So, but we're not going to worry about that at the moment. So, dynamic. So we're going to register. Add servlet exporter. Okay. Set load on startup. So as you can see, this is should be very, very familiar from your web.xml. So all of these components here would have analogs in a web.xml. You have your context loader listener set up, and you'd have your servlet and your servlet mapping, and hopefully you can see how much easier that is to do than setting up all that web.xml stuff. So, yes. Right. And I'll send the links. The links are in the presentation. What's out there right now in my GitHub for this particular presentation is the base project with nothing in it. As soon as I'm done with the presentation and we've built this project out, I will push what we've built out to GitHub, and then you'll be able to look at all of this extra stuff that we've added. So, okay. So there's our configuration. There's our initializer. Let's just see if we can run this on TC server. It's taking a little longer to start here on this, and we'll notice this as we're going along and working with this. But actually, what's happening here is I've got Insight running on this, and Insight's doing some weaving and some other magic so that we can look at drill down into things. So that's why it's taking a little longer to get started here. Okay, and popped up our little embedded browser here, and you'll see this is just the default settings for how that's exported in TC server, and this is our JSON data that we're getting back. So here's our links property, and we've got a rel, and we've got a reference to our add repository, which is our add repository, and our add campaign repository, right? And that's what these analogs here are. let's look at let's go over to the REST shell, which we've been demonstrating. This is also on my GitHub. I just updated it yesterday with some more bells and whistles. So there's a binary download out there that you can get for this, or you can check out the source code or whatever. So because we're using this links property, we can discover resources that are available, and we can cache them by rel, so that we can refer to the rel later in the shell and not have to type out the whole URL. So that's basically the idea behind discover, and it's a little more compact way to display what's available. If you just do a get, you'll see this is the same thing as we saw here. This is our output, right? This is our JSON output that we've got right here. And then we've got our references to our repository. So we've got several. I'm sorry. Yes. I'm sorry. What? How does it discover? The discover process just looks in the links property. Whatever is in there that looks like a link object will be discovered. So if you're creating a custom resource, as long as you conform to this, using Spring HatOS library or however you want to do it, as a map, then those resources can be discovered and you can reference them from the shell. But there's nothing magical about it. I mean, it's just a links property. Yes. Mm-hmm. Okay. Right. Mm-hmm. The question is how are these links generated? And that's a good question that we'll cover a couple slides later when we get to the actual configuration. Suffice it to say, at the moment, since it's in the default configuration, whatever the servlet is exposed under is what's going to be used as the base URI. Now we can change that to whatever we want when we run it behind a proxy, because we have no idea what the actual URL on the front end was, especially if the proxy doesn't pass along the forwarded for header or whatever. So we can change that, but just for right now we'll just look at these as being how they're exposed under the servlet container. So a few commands in here to kind of give you like a ls and cd type functionality to just kind of make it easy. Is list does a similar function to discover, but discover resets the base URI. So if you remember when I did discover and I gave it a relative path, it actually changed the base URI into what I gave it, and then did a get and looked for the links and pulled out and printed out that table. So list simply does a get, looks in the links, and prints out what's available for you. You can follow, and it resets the base URI. Okay, but it doesn't rediscover whatever resources are available. So there's a couple different ways that that we can look at this. So we've gone into our add repository here, and we see there is one exposed. Do get one. Okay, so that particular entity actually came from my little loader bean here, where I'm creating a new ad, and I'm creating a new campaign. I'm adding the ad to the campaign, and I'm saving those using the repositories. So I've saved this out. I've created this instance out of band, right? So these exist in the database already, and I'm just able to access them, directly. But the whole point of having the REST API is that you can create new instances of things. So now I've got two. Right. And here's my ad that I just created. No. I can do. Yep. Let's just load a couple of them up here. Okay. So we've got several of them to work with. We can put, I guess I better give it a path. Let's update 3. The question is it possible to change which entities are exposed? Meaning what exactly? Like a subset of entities? On read, yes, because you can use Finder, right? But it's not as simple as that. Whenever you're doing updates and things like that. Now, it is possible because there are events happening every time I update or delete or do any of these actions. So you can actually intercept the resource coming back out and delete links or add links. Do what do those sorts of things. But I mean that's something you'd have to add. There's no annotation you can put on it that say here's the query of ones to exclude. So that's a good question though. Yes. So the question was. Mm-hmm. So the question was, can you change the representation, transform it into something else, like maybe you don't want to expose, update it or whatever. So yes, you can. What some of these issues are going to come down to in using the exporter is it's not as simple, as always just plopping a little component in there. Although it is actually that simple, but what I'm getting at is it's easy to tie into these processes so that you can change what's coming out, but it's not always as simple as what you might think to actually go about doing that. Because then what do I exclude and how do I? Because there's a fair amount of work that goes on behind the scenes here to turn an entity into a JSON representation, right? So I'm not just taking the entity and sending it to Jackson, right? I mean, if we look at if we go up here, for example, and we look at our ad campaigns, which have a relationship between the campaign and the ad, we'll see. We'll see our related property, our one-to-many, as being a link, right? And that link points to a URL that we can access to get the list of ads that are associated with this particular campaign. And then each individual ad you can reference in that association. Let's... So here's our related entities, right? Now, one of the things that you probably didn't realize, if you haven't been paying close attention, is my links property it's empty. When I was discovering resources, I was actually setting an accept type of a compact form of JSON, which does not inline entities into the JSON representation. So by default, if you just select to give a list of what entities are at a particular resource, you're going to get that first level of entities actually in the content property. And they'll look, each one of them will have a self link, and it will have, it may have other related properties and links to other places for that entity. But the actual content of the entity will show up in that content. But that may not always be desirable, depending on whether you're using paging or how much data is actually in there. So let's set application. X spring-data / compact JSON. Now what we get is nothing in the content because we're not inlining entities. We're only referencing them by link. So good for summaries, finding what's there, and not having to pull down the entire list because you're maybe, this isn't the final destination that you're trying to get to. This is just one step along the way. So you can use the compact JSON type to get a compact list of entities. Okay. Now, one of the things that may not be desirable is the default way that we generate a rel. And like I said, if we're going to be using Spring HatOS, or we're using any HatOS resource, then the rel is going to become important. And so basically, what you can probably divine from how this is set up is that our repository is exported under the name of whatever comes before the word repository, lowercase, right? That's the first character lowercase, and then the type that's being managed by the repository in its simple name, right? So that's the the algorithm basically that we use to generate that. But maybe you don't like, you're one of those that actually likes plurals rather than singular, and you're particular about that. You'll notice that we're exposed under singular, add singular. We have a REST resource annotation we can put on repositories and finder methods and CRUD methods and things like that. They give us a couple options. Whether or not to expose this at all, what path to expose it under, and then what rel to use when you do expose it. So let's call this adds. Let's see if it'll automatically update. And there's our adds. And it's carried down through the hierarchy. So when we go to the next level of generating the rel, then we're going to use the rel value that you've used at the repository level. One other thing, while we're in there monkeying with things, we're extending CRUD repository. So we're going to. Can't I do that override? Okay. Yeah, I thought you could just do that override, but anyway, let's look at our. That figures. Oh, there we go. Okay. Let's say that we do not want people deleting things. And then our ID type for this particular entity is a long. And what was that other one? There's two of them. We got to make sure that we get them both. Make sure that we get them both. Oh, there we go. Ooh, that's interesting. that's weird. Getting an error there. The path hasn't changed. The rel has changed, right? So now you can see there's a difference. Like if I reference, ads plural, that's not a URL. That's a rel value. So those are different. So I don't know. That's weird. That was the one thing I actually didn't test on this, so I know that's a shocker. But anyway, it does actually if you want to override your CRUD methods and turn them off, then you put exported equals false on there. Okay. It will give you a what's this 400 status code denied or whatever, illegal I forget what the status code is. It's 400 error status code. Yes. Okay. That could be. I must have changed something here. It's creating it. What do we got here? Some kind of no mapping found. Oh, that's because I didn't say add to. Okay. Okay, sorry about that. Now, so we've talked about the different references that to links and the different how resources can reference one another and how they're linked together. And one of the things about our repositories is that we can add finders. Okay. Now, one of the yes. I will when I get to the resource processor, which is actually next on my list. So yes. Now, when we looked at that earlier, we didn't see the search parameter because we didn't have any finders. But now that we added a finder, we get this additional link. Okay, there's our find by active is true. Okay, so there's our finder being executed, and the results returned just like they would if you were referencing the list of resources. But again, that's probably not how we want to generally reference that. Let's just call it active because we're lazy and we don't like to type much. Okay, there we go. Okay, so now we've changed the path under which that was exported. Okay. Now, one of the things that we can do now, actually, I mentioned we were going to customize our configuration a little bit, that you can split that up. So let's application rest config. Let's actually go about doing that. We're going to create a configuration here. We're going to import the repository rest MVC configuration, make sure that that's all set up. And let's add a resource processor. Now, resource processors are in the Spring HatOS library. And they allow you to add links, delete links, add. So we have a link object. We can set. Now here's where we would want to do something a little more intelligent than just this. Other resource. Okay, and then return that. Okay, looks okay. Looks like my example anyway. So let's see if this actually does what it's supposed to do. As soon as I go over here to restart this, it's going to reload. What do you bet? Beat it. Okay, so here we have an additional link that we added by our resource processor, which is a standard component that is really kind of designed to be used, in your own applications as well. There's other Spring MVC components that can if you're creating a controller and you're returning a resource to have your own machinery, handle it. There's Spring HatOS library includes some Spring MVC components to automatically apply resource processors that exist in your application context and things like that. So we're actually doing it a little bit differently than that, but that's something that you'll want to keep in mind, that whenever you're dealing with resources, it kind of separates those out a little bit so that you can add and remove links and do things like that. One of the things that we've didn't add here, but let's go ahead and do that now, is a version. Let's add a couple. Okay. So pretty standard fare. Have a version property. Let Hibernate update that for me. And one of the things that Spring Data REST will do for you, if you have a version property, now, where is it? I don't see it. Well, we don't expose. Same reason we don't expose ID, because it's an internal thing. It's an internal concern. And one of the things that you have to keep in mind when you're working with HTTP resources and REST resources and whatnot is that what you expose as a REST service is not the entity. The ID property does not go in the JSON representation of the entity, because you're not exposing the entity. You're exposing a resource that is a proxy to the entity. The reference to that entity via your resource is the link, the self link. Okay, now whether that corresponds to the actual URL you're using to access it, or if it's from the links and it's the self link in a list of entities, you're not going to get your ID as a property in the JSON document, right? That's a design decision to enforce this idea that when you reference an entity, you're using, the link is your ID, okay? So version is similar, but not exactly the same. So by default, we don't expose it because it is an E tag. So if you look in our headers, you will see the version number listed as an E tag. So let's see what do we get here. Okay. Active false. Okay, now we're at version 1. So we can do some cool stuff. Name, if none match. This is where it gets a little weird. We're using quotes around the value, so you have to send the quotes as well. Seems a little weird, but it's just the way it works. Now we get a not modified. Okay. So we can use E-tag caching directly based on a version property in our entity. Okay. Any questions so far?
So that means on the client side, you should remember the E-tag?
Yes.
Which you got last time so that you can ask for.
In general, I think it's a good idea to keep track of your rels and to keep track of the IDs and the E-tags and any of this metadata when you're dealing with entities. You know, one of the discoverability aspects of Spring HatOS or, you know, HatOS in general is that you don't have to have advanced knowledge. So that's definitely true that you don't have to have advanced knowledge of these entities. You can discover everything you need. But the client probably wants to keep track of references to URLs based on rel and things like that, that, you know, you'll need to maintain some state in the client. So, okay. Validation. Okay. We don't really want people to be able to create one of these things without giving us a title or some content. Okay. JSR 303 annotations. Nothing fancy about that. Okay. Blows up. There's our validation error coming back from Hibernate. But that's not very informative. So let's say message equals you must provide a title. You must provide content. Okay. The restart going on that. Now, that's obviously not, I mean, we probably don't want to be putting our error messages directly in our source code. So you can use a message, you know, your general message resource setup in your application context, so you can do your internationalization and whatnot. Rather than using a, you know, an English string in there, you might want to just use a key on your error message, and the REST exporter will look in your resources that you have in your application context and pull that message out like you would if it was doing it in some other way. Okay, so you must provide content. You must provide a title. Okay, so we can do JSR 303 validation for, you know, lots of different situations here. But that may not always be enough. there may be other dependent resources that need to exist first, or various other situations. So Spring Data REST also supports the Spring Validator. Okay, I'm going to validate an add here. And I'm just doing these, as inner classes just to make it easier. Supports. Use class utils is assignable. And then we're going to call this, we want to only do adds in this particular validator. Okay. Let's turn, since we know we're going to be working with adds, let's do this kind of naively. Now, one of the things that we're going to need to be a little careful about when we're doing validators is that we do have the JSR 303 validator on there, but it runs afterwards. When we try and put it in the database, that's what's going to do its validation. These validators run before that, so if we're doing null validation, then we need to remember that. So I'm sorry, did somebody? So the question was, if you do an error here, how was it? How did you phrase the last part of it? Right. Right. It's never going to get to the JSR 303 validation if it fails here. That is correct. You can load up all the errors that you want in here, but if it's assumed that if it doesn't pass validation, if it doesn't pass muster here, then there's no need to try and go on. So we could say let's do this. Put a list of words that we don't like. Okay, we don't like the word Barney because he's weird. Okay, not the person Barney, but the purple dinosaur. So. Validator. What was that? Trying to be way too helpful here. And so here's where we would reject this value of title, and then we would say because it contains a bad word. And we could also one of the things that we're actually in Spring Data REST, we're processing the messages. We're processing the messages in Spring Data REST. So the first three parameters that you get are going to be the type name, the property name, and the value that was attempted to be placed in there. So you don't have to add anything extra on this if you don't need to. But you'll get those parameters for free in your message format there if you just do curly brace 0, curly brace 1. Okay, so we got a bad word validator here for our ads. Let's just make sure, look over everything. Oh, you know what, actually, lowercase that first. Okay. Yes. Ah, sticky wicket. The question was, how do we manage security? Well, are you familiar with the React database? Key value store has an HTTP interface, written in Erlang. It's a pretty cool little thing. And it provides an HTTP interface out of the box. And it doesn't provide any authentication or authorization for the HTTP interface. And that is really by design, because the HTTP interface is not necessarily designed to be used in that situation by the outside world. Now this HTTP interface is designed to be used by the outside world, which is why it's in Spring MVC, which is why you can add Spring Security to it. However, caveated, if you're doing machine-to-machine communication, there's other issues going on there. That's where the OAuth and basic authentication, things like that, are going to come in to play. So there isn't any by default setup for doing security, but since it is a Spring MVC application, whatever you're already doing to secure your web app is assumed that we can just kind of put the exporter underneath that umbrella. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you'd want to set those URLs up, right? Yeah, in your Spring Security. I haven't tried it very in any complicated way, but I have heard that people have used basic authentication. It seems to work. So like I say, it's a Spring MVC application, so that should work. I'm sorry, what? Mm. Okay, the question was, can you put @secured on a repository method? I assume you're talking about a repository method, right? And so I will just say I haven't tried that, but I don't see any reason why that wouldn't work, right? Be a good experiment. So we want to make sure that nobody that sells vintage Barney DVDs can place an ad on our ad serving network. That wasn't supposed to happen. Well, it should. I did lowercase it, didn't I? Yeah, the thing about that's confusing to look at in the REST shell, and that's one of the things that is kind of weird about including JSON directly in the shell, is that it kind of does this weird quote escaping thing, and that's part of the way this is based on the Spring shell, and the Spring shell does in some areas some naive parsing of parameters to options, so like you can't put a space there and things like that. It'll start getting confused. Now, if you need to get any more complicated JSON using the REST shell, then you just create a JSON file that has your JSON in it, and when you're doing a post here, you would say from test file.json or test directory, which has JSON files in it, to load it that way. So I don't know. I don't really want to get into this. Worked earlier, so let's just go with our validator will work if we get it set up to look for the right thing, and go with that. Yes. That's a good question. The question was, when is it validating? And the answer lies in the supports. So any update operation is going to be validated against this validator. So not always easy to figure out what's going on there. You may have to look it up and see, does this exist, already, other things like that. So that's the Spring validator. There are events that happen inside Spring Data REST. Application events get emitted whenever update operations happen, or there's if we bounce over to the wiki real quick. Spring Data REST wiki, you can see application events, and here's our before save, after save, before link save, after link save, before delete, after delete. So these are application events that get emitted into the application context that we can set up a normal application listener for, or we can create, there are some annotations, there's some helper classes that we create in Spring Data REST to kind of help with that a little bit. So let's grab an after save handler. We're just going to create a Pojo here, mark it as a component. Repository event, we want to tell it that this is a repository event handler for the add type. Handle after save. Now the magic for this is going to happen in the helper that we have. Get around that. Let's go down here. So we have an annotated handler repository event listener. Okay, handler listener. We'll call that. Event listener, and we want to give it our REST handlers. Okay. So this is not created by default because we're giving it a package name. We don't. But I hope I saved that other one. If not, we'll be restarting this. We don't create this component by default. Because we need this package name of your handlers, and it just does some basic component scanning. One thing I will say about this that's a little bit not obvious just by looking at it is we are looking for this type, this annotated type, but we're also looking for beans. So you can define an entire package of handlers that are of handling different entities, but you don't. It's not going to run them if you don't have a bean instantiated of that type. So that we're just using component here because we want one of these, but we wouldn't have to use component. We could rely on only the ones instantiated in our application context, however we defined that. So let's see if we're gonna post. Oh, yep. Data. there's our original one. Well, I got a pretty good record today. That one didn't work either. Saved and add. Just make sure I got everything set up. Make sure I spelled it correctly. Handle after save. Yeah, there's another one that worked about an hour ago. If you'd have seen it. Okay, that is the annotated listener. We can also, let's just do this in our configuration here. I bet you what it was is I didn't have that other class saved, I think is what happened. So we may end up getting a couple of them here. Just save event. Okay. So this, as you can see, since it's just a normal application event, we don't really, it's not filtered. So anytime there's a save of any kind, we're going to get this event. So we'll have to check our source, So if event.getSource instance of add, add, and we'll see. Hopefully we'll get, oops, events not get source. Okay. Let's reload this guy. So we know our validation's working. That's good. How are we doing on time? Doing pretty good. I do want to get to a couple more things I got on my list here. I don't think I'm going to get to all of them though. There are, while we're waiting on that to come up, there are a couple different ways to integrate your own processing with the Spring Data REST exporter. One of the things we can do is register in the application context modules. And so the way to extend Jackson and add behavior to it is to create a module and register it with the object mapper. So that's what we're doing here. There's nothing fancy about this. This is just this is a date format module. And if you remember from looking over here, our created date was in the seconds thing. So what we're going to do is an ISO 8601 date format here, and we'll add that in so that it'll be picked up next time. But so 8601 date format module. Okay. Let's not save that. Just yet. Okay, yeah, that's what it was. I missed my save on that earlier. So there you see my after save event from my annotated handler, and the after save event coming through the application events as well. So that actually opens up a kind of an interesting thing that you can do. And as Spring integration, we've talked a lot about it this last couple days. And let me pull up my snippets. Yeah, see, I'm not even going to get to show you the Knockout.js web app that I had set up there. But let's go ahead and copy the Spring integration stuff in. And one of the things that our configuration does, the Spring Data REST configuration, is it does an import on this class path star resource right here. So any XML files that you have under this meta-inf Spring Data REST, and you end it with export, will be picked up in XML format and put into the application context. So if we have our XML in here, and I'm pretty sure Rabbit's running, let's save that. Yep. I think we got Rabbit. Yeah, make sure we got our queue here. And there's our RabbitMQ messages. Okay, so what we ended up getting in here, and we don't really, I didn't include a lot of contextual information, like, and I didn't do checking for, before events, because this is a before save event coming through. But I just basically wanted to show that exercise to the reader that you can create a transformer that uses our special Jackson module, which does that, looking for linked properties and pulls in the links and generates the JSON. And this JSON is, this particular JSON here is identical to what you'd get if you use the REST interface, right? So that is coming through, we're getting the post and we're emitting an event, and then we're picking it up in Spring integration. We're looking for all repository events. We could filter it by, after save, after delete, whatever, if we wanted to. And we're using our special transformer and then sending it to Rabbit. Okay. Jackson configuration. Let's see if that's, yeah, there. So we got our special Jackson configuration picked up. So now we're doing our date formatting in a different way. So one of the other things that we do internally is use a converter. The Spring converter interface, we have a entity to resource converter, and it's just a generic one that does what we're talking about with the linked properties and whatnot, and looks to see, okay, I have a relationship on this particular property. Is this type managed by a repository? If so, create a link out of it, right? That sort of thing is what we're doing in that resource converter, and we're sending back a Spring HatOS resource. So you were asking earlier about, can we change the representation? So yes, you can completely change the representation by providing your own resource of however you want to send the JSON back. Of course, you won't get some of the extra goodies, but register a converter for your particular domain type. If we wanted to do an add to resource converter, we could create one and register it in a conversion service, and then which would be picked up by the exporter, and then it would use that to, or we could do Jackson. We could register our own Jackson module to if we see an add object or a resource object, we could handle it differently. And one thing I did want to show real quick here on the finder method. So if we say we want to get a list of ads, find by created after date when. Okay, one of the things that we need to do when we're working with query parameters is that we need to, this is actually optional when you're using repositories themselves, but not optional when you're using them from the web, because we don't really have any way to get the name of that variable currently, not until Java 8 or 9 or whenever, that will be included in there. So we need to include a parameter. But we don't have an automatic conversion between a string and a date. And we may not, we may want to decide how we present that date string. So when we're doing our parameters, we can do a convert with. And I have done up ahead of time. So what is that thing called? ISO 8601 string to date converter. And so I've created a converter that takes a array of strings, because when we're in Spring MVC, when we're pulling out parameters, it's going to give us an array of strings, and that's just something to keep in mind. That's just how that's going to work. An array of strings to a date, and then we're just doing the simple date format on that. Where did my add repository go? Convert with. Okay. So there's that. All right. Okay. Went through all that trouble and then it reformatted it for me. Okay. One of the things about the REST shell, real quick. Let's get one. Query parameters are passed as a little JSON string, because we can do encoding and neat things like that. Callback. So here we're getting our JSONP callback wrapped. If we generated an error, we'd get the same. We'd call an error back by default. In our original configuration, one of the things we want to do now is there's a repository REST configuration object, which is where you customize the way the exporter works. So we can set the base URI. So if we're behind a proxy, we can set our own list of custom converters for doing HTTP message conversion. The default media type is JSON, and I don't even know why there's a switch there, but there is. The page size by default is 20. And one of the nice things about using the repositories is that we can paging and sorting repository can return a page. All right. Spring Data. Yep, forgot about that. It's a good thing it checks that. I guess that's I think we can spell that without the E, but anyway, it's spelled with the E, so British spelling, I guess. I don't know on that. I'm going to have to show you that insight stuff too. If we're going to do all this waiting on it to do all that weaving, then it should at least pay off. So now that we've implemented paging and sorting repository, we get paging information. So by default, it's 20, and so we can do we can do all of our paging, and if we were going to pass our parameter, we'd say page equals like 2 or whatever, and we'd pass a query parameter of what page we're interested in. So any questions so far? I think we're kind of yes. Our relationship, what?
How do you handle those data REST?
The question is, how do you handle related entities, and do you actually see them? The idea is that when we provide a link to, oops, let's go up. They'll be inline there, or they will be at a specific URL, and that refers to that entity that's related to the campaign directly. And I could delete that, and it'd be gone. So I've not deleted that ad. I just deleted the relationship between the campaign and the ad. Okay. Any other questions? There's a little bit more to it. You can go to the Spring Data REST page. You can go to the source code. There is an example project, Spring Data REST Web MVC, on the Spring Source GitHub. The REST shell is on my own personal GitHub for the time being. There's a fair amount of documentation in there about the different parameters and like how to output to a file, how to read from a file, the various things like that. Yes.
So by nature it supports like a kind of a deep e-tagging, right? Because in the e-tag also there is a concept called shallow e-tag and the deep e-tag.
Mm-hmm.
So it supports the deep e-tagging, means whenever somebody changes the data, there's a version number change, and based on that.
It depends on what you mean by shallow e-tag. So the question is, does it do just the basic shallow e-tag or deep e-tag based on the version, right? So it's pretty naive. It's not caching, right? So whatever the version number is what's going to get wrapped in quotes and stuck in an e-tag. There's no calculation done. So if the version number changes, your e-tag will change. If the version number doesn't change, your e-tag won't change. It's very naive. If you put the @rest resource on your version property and give it a path, you can export the actual version number directly in the JSON, and then you can do whatever you want to with it and cache it and check it and things like that. So yes, back here. Yeah, like if you want a JSON ignore property, the question was, can you use the JSON annotations in your entity? And yes, you can. You can turn them off and massage them, give them converters. Anything that you can do in Jackson in an annotation, you can put in your entity to influence the way Jackson serializes the entity. Or you could add a module, or there's various ways to do the same thing, basically. Yeah. So, any other questions as we're finishing up? Yes. The slides, yeah, I've got to render these out to PDF. There's actually, I ended up doing a lot on demo, and I only made it to slide 8, and there's like, I don't know, there's like 30 of them in here, right? So, I'll get these rendered out. Maybe I should have gone by my code examples on the slides, and they would have worked a little better. But I'll render those out in PDF or something, and put those on GitHub with the sample project. Yeah, this particular app that I've got here is on my GitHub in this S12GX 2012 REST project, and I'll put the PDF in there along with the updated working example of the validators and things like that. Yes, Mark? I can do that as well. Sure. Yeah, I can do that. I'll update that on the official Spring website with the presentation and everything. Yeah. So. I'm sorry. What? Yep.
Where's the site where the main site where they're being updated on? When updates are coming?
The presentations, you mean? It's going to be on the springone2gx.com or on the sessions where you can, yeah.
So that this presentation will be there as well?
Yes. Yep. Yeah, I'll do that. So make sure you guys have that. So if there's no other questions, I mean, you can come up here and stay if you want. Thanks for coming to the conference.